अगले सत्र के लिए मंच पर आ रही हैं मेरी सहयोगी रितु।
Thank you, Komal. The last 2 years have forced a transition of the established norm in many fields through work from home, e-learning, virtual exam, and so on. For any educated Indian, the next biggest challenge would be implementation of a grading system that focuses on holistic development of all students rather than honoring a select few who manage to achieve inexplicably high grades. Not only does demotivate the majority, but also creates a lopsided one-size-fits-all approach. The implementation of few changes can help overall the system and benefit all our students. Students are often put on the treadmill of entrance examination preparations, subjected to high-pressure learning of skills which are useful only for passing an entrance exam, creating a situation where the surgery is successful, but the patient is critical. Our next session is Designing Assessment for Holistic Learning. And for this, I extend a joyous welcome to our speakers, the distinguished Professor Bill Lucas, University of Winchester, United Kingdom, the much acclaimed Professor Sandra Milligan, Director, Assessment Research Centre, the University of Melbourne, Australia, the renowned Dr. Jayashree Oja, Senior Expert and International Consultant, Advisor, Central Square Foundation. I extend a hearty welcome to the moderators of the session who would take the discussion forward. For this, I request Ms. Meenakshi Kushwaha, Secretary NPSC and Principal Birla Vidyaniketan. We also have Ms. Anuradha Joshi, who unfortunately could not be part of this due to a family emergency. Ms. Tanya Joshi, Executive Member, NPSC, and Principal, the Indian School, has kindly consented to be the coordinator of this session. Over to you, ma'am.
Meenakshi, you're on mute.
Good afternoon from India. It is my pleasure to introduce the session on designing assessments for holistic learning. We know that assessments can be of learning, for learning, and as learning. Holistic learning would, in brief, mean learning that is for the growth of mind, body, and soul, drawn from experiences and catering to each individual child so as to promote a growth mindset. Most assessments, unfortunately, which are currently popular in schools, take their cue from standardized tests designed for school living or for college entrance. These tests more often use a ranking mechanism to place learners on a scale that is either alphabetic or numeric, comparing students of different abilities at the same level, and generate immense stress. And they do not really tell us much about their growth. The pandemic has drawn greater attention to what and how schools assess and whether these assessments really serve in helping young people develop the 21st century skills. It's time for us educators to conduct assessments to know what children have learned and how well are they being prepared for life. As we sit here today, we have guests from very different time zones of the world discussing problems and solutions that appear to be universal. We are glad, Professor Bill Lucas, that you could join us from UK, where it's early morning, and Professor Sandra from Australia, where it is late evening, and Dr. Jayashree Oza in the afternoon in India. With this, I request Tanya to take the session forward.
Thank you, Meenakshi. I think you started off the session that, yes, we've got all the, we've got the morning, we've got the afternoon, and we've got the late evening also with us. The thing is that, yes, we are discussing holistic learning. How is assessment going to be for holistic learning? And in fact, all our schools pride ourselves in saying that we cater to the holistic development of children. And I'm not going to take too much of time because I think we need to hear all three of you. So Professor Bill Lucas is actually the director of the Center for Real Learning, and he founded the CRL in 2008. But what, while reading your CV, what really, made me more interested in what you're doing is that it was very nicely written that you are not only an author, you're not only a director, but you're also a leader of movements. So Professor Lucas, I invite you to start with your interaction with all of us and tell us what or how do we really change our assessment patterns. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen and
sure.
Oh, I wonder if somebody could give me the screen sharing rights back, please. Thank you very much. And tell me if you can see that.
Yes, we can.
All right, let me just get it into the right. How is that? Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. Okay, so in my 12 minutes, I want to give you a quick tour of some of the very many exciting things that are happening in the world that are absolutely about finding assessment systems that will better acknowledge young people's strengths, what I'm calling expansive learning and what you're calling holistic learning. I think we're in a very similar place across the world, whether we're in Wales or in the United States or in Australia, or closer to hand here in a combination of Australia and England. There are groups like ours and the one you're going to hear from Sandra Milligan, who are getting much closer in thinking about the urgency of change in terms of assessment and in terms, of course, of curriculum. Whether you're looking at the World Economic Forum model or indeed the Centre for Curriculum Redesign or 20 other models I could share with you, we're moving towards a world where, as well as foundationally literate young men and women, we want a lot of other things as well. I won't get distracted into the language here or in precisely the different ways in which these things can be laid out. It's interesting to see how much, when you look across the world, as the Brookings Institution has done recently, when it comes to pedagogy and assessment, we don't have answers. We may believe that we know what the curriculum should look like, but we haven't, at least in a formal sense, properly acknowledged and described the ways in which we might best teach and then best evidence progress in these areas. So it's in those sorts of areas, I think, that all of us need to be focusing at the moment. I'm delighted to see the way that the new Indian national curriculum is emerging. And I would say, wouldn't I, but it's very close in spirit to the kind of work I've been doing with my colleagues, Guy Claxon and Ellen Spencer. And here, this is a collaboration with the Australian Council for Educational Research. I'm going to take you, as I said, on a very quick tour of some of the things that are exciting us from across the world. And this Rethinking Assessment overview is a partnership with the Centre for Strategic Education in Melbourne. And I'll just touch very, very lightly on some of the different ways in which educators are beginning to see that we can move beyond paper and pencil examinations, largely demanding memory, not exclusively, and very often taking place on just one particular time, possibly two times in any particular year. Before I embark on this tour, let me present to you some of the trends that we observe in the organization that I'm part of, Rethinking Assessment. We see, and there's always a danger when you have two sets of lists that people will think these are binary. Forgive me, they're not meant to be. They're meant to be indications of a direction of travel. On the left, you've got a number of things that many of us will recognize because in many countries, in many educational jurisdictions, they are the kind of things that are the status quo. On the right are the kind of directions of travel. And for me, it's the last four on this list that are giving me most cause for optimism and also challenge, that we need better to be able to describe individual progression, that we need to think more about students' roles in this. Of course, we need to recognize the accountability role, but there's there's an assessment for improvement role, or as a colleague said just now, assessment as learning role. And I think we've got to be just so much more subtle in the repertoire of assessment tools that we use. So, and I'm not suggesting that any busy teacher or principal would necessarily want to use all of these, but were you to want to try and track and evidence the development of some of the things that appeared in those earlier curriculum models, possibly under the headline of character or even metacognition, here are some very interesting tools that you might choose to use. Some of them are conventional self-report psychometric tests. Others are more electronic, like the very interesting Harvard Human Flourishing app. We used to think of multiple choice as rather dim, as rather dull, as rather simple. There are many other examples which are much more interested in evidencing lifelong learning capabilities, as well as the kind of more conventional uses of multiple choice tests. In Pisa, which I'm sure you're familiar with, we're moving towards a very different world in the innovative domain. The test I've been involved in helping to develop is the Pisa 2022 test of creative thinking, which will be happening in some countries in June this year. And earlier on, colleagues in Melbourne had led significant work on the thinking about collaborative problem solving, which was the focus of the 2015 test. I'm offering these to you because they're beginning to show how things that don't appear in schools, or certainly not on school timetables, are beginning to be seen to be important. And not just that, beginning to be seen as something you can get better at, and also that you can make a realistic, fair-minded, valid assessment of. Now, the act of assessment is not so important to me as all the processes it brings with us, the rigor and the better understanding, so that as we go forward formatively, we can evidence these kinds of things. We've always known that being an engineer or being a doctor, for example, required more than, if you like, book knowledge. And this is increasingly being recognized in schools, where we see the focus on extended investigations and projects. Here are just a few examples that are now part of formal assessed opportunities, mainly in this example drawn from England and from Australia. But you can see, interestingly too, that once you get out into higher education, these things are seen as very normal. Back to the engineer and doctor I just showed you, both of them would expect in their higher education experience to have a rigorous opportunity, not just a pencil and paper opportunity, to show what they can do and what they can do over time, and what they can do when they're being asked things that they've not necessarily specifically been prepared for. There is a movement as well, which is a helpful one in the main, to break bigger ideas down into smaller ideas and to take from the uniform groups, such as the Scouts and the Guides across the world, what we used to think of as badges, and make these digital. And there are many, many companies and organizations exploring this. This is an example, interestingly, from teacher education and from the United States, but I could have given you many other examples. My question to any educator here is, I wonder how we could use these to better evidence those things which aren't complete courses, or maybe aren't on the formal curriculum in school. Somewhere in the middle of all this is a recognition that assessment plays so many different roles. We want to show our best work, we want to show work in progress, and sometimes we need those more formal moments where we look at how we're doing. And often, of course, it's a hybrid. And the digital portfolio, I think, which is a series of aggregated digital badges, is going to be the way that most schools begin to curate, or their students begin to curate progression as they go through their school life. It is very strange, isn't it, that when we're taking the driving test, we don't put people into a room and simply ask them to recall what they can remember about driving on the roads. Of course, I'm being silly. The very point of a driving test is that it combines theory and practice in the real world. Many countries across the world have musical tests taken on demand when you're ready. And that's a discussion between you and your music teacher and then it's a mixture of different kinds of theory and practice. And increasingly in universities during COVID, we've had to get much clearer about the necessity of having online open book examinations. If it's good for higher education, why not for schools? I'm working closely with colleagues in an organization called Voice 21 that seems oracy, that believes oracy is an undervalued element of both curriculum and assessment practices. In many countries, we're looking at assessment as a fun activity where it can be built into a game. Here in Georgia, in the States, is an example of an early years or primary example. And here are two examples from the state of Victoria in Australia, which has been pioneering the use of these kind of games-based, authentic, scenario-based examples, looking at secondary critical and creative thinking. All roads, I think, lead towards bringing together what young people can do in some kind of profile as they emerge from higher secondary, so that it's no longer an ATAR score or a SAT score or a combination of A-level scores that get aggregated up for a university entrance role. Now, this is the International Baccalaureate. You may be familiar with this. And this is fine, but it's actually just a statement of intent. It's not a profile that really pulls all these things together. Sandra and her colleagues in Australia have been doing brilliant work on this. And indeed, I think Australia is leading the world here in thinking about the different ways in which we might express this. Interesting work too with our colleagues at the Mastery Transcript Consortium in the United States. Note, of course, the number that still shouts out to you from that credit profile. Interestingly, that's not going to be the case in the next iteration of this particular approach. And another example from International Big Picture in Australia here, again, collaborating very strongly with Sandra and her group and raising all the issues that we need to be thinking about. Particularly interesting that in Australia, there is such a distinct policy recommendation that you might be moving away from the end of school life ATAR score to this kind of approach. Putting all this together, I think, and this is really powerfully important for teachers, we need to build assessment literacy and competence. And that's where we're going at the Rethinking Assessment movement. We, like many, are developing a profile, and ours will have similar versions to many of the others being defined. It has a different approach to what counts. It has intermingled 3, not 4 C's. We've combined creativity and critical thinking as Pisa has. And it has and this is of course not what it will look like, this is just the content. It has a heavy learner agency and an opportunity to explore beautiful work, and as a place where learners are sharing their ability to be an effective learner. Here in the UK, we're now embarked on a series of action research pilots. From my particular perspective, I'm leading one on the work that I've been most interested in, which is number 4 and 5, looking at how creativity and critical thinking can be embedded on all aspects of the school curriculum. We've just recently launched a series of action research projects, which will take place in this term and next term. And then we'll have a much more focused intervention study lasting for 1 and 2 years, beginning in September this year. We really need to understand better how this works in a curriculum in England, where, unlike in Australia, we don't have critical and creative thinking as a guiding, overarching general capability. So in this work, I've been drawing on the thinking we've been doing at the Centre for Real World Learning and our model of creativity, which was picked up by the OECD and led to the role I now have been playing for Pisa in the test of creative thinking. Nearly there. There are some schools, and I here give you the example of Thomas Tallis School in London. I could equally have chosen Rooty Hill High School in Sydney and many others in 30+ countries across the world who are combining critical thinking and creativity and the subjects of the school curriculum and bringing these together so that this is a kind of parallel school timetable that brings to the fore the capabilities and dispositions that we think are equally valuable to subject and disciplinary learning. We know quite a lot about how to assess them, and in some cases, it's slightly different from the way that we've been assessing other kinds of learning in schools. We now have some definitions here in England, albeit not yet national policy, but we have something to work with the Durham Commission. And we're in close collaboration with our friends at ACR, who have a UK body, and we're very impressed and working with their rubrics and models and approaches for what we're calling creative thinking, which is a combination of both of those things. Recently, and it'll be launched later next week, we put together with friends in Perth a field guide to assessing creative thinking in schools. And I look forward, it's a Creative Commons publication, to sharing that very widely. And I conclude now with this, my favorite quotation from William Randolph: to solely use standardized achievement tests is like casting a net into the sea, a net that is intentionally designed to let the most interesting fish get away. Then to describe the ones that are caught strictly in terms of their weights and length is to radically reduce what we know about them. To further conclude that all the contents of the sea consist of fish like those in the net compounds the error further. We need more kinds of fish. We need to know more about those we catch. We need new nets. And I love that joyful session we've just been watching, and thought you might be interested. My most recent book with my colleague Alan Spencer is all about joy, or what we're calling zest for learning in schools. Thanks so much for listening. I'm sorry I've just gone over a couple of minutes longer than you invited me. I'll come off the screen share now.
Professor Bill, not at all, because I think all of us had a very good afternoon by listening to those two young girls. But you have actually told us what assessment is all about and how we can put it into practice, because standardized assessment is something which we were all a part of till very recently, and we are trying to change that. There's one question which I would like to ask you, is if you could throw some light on the difference between learning objectives and goals while designing the assessment for holistic learning.
I'm afraid we don't have 5 hours to discuss that, but I would go through at quite a simple level, and forgive me, this is oversimplifying.
Okay.
I think when we specify the desired outcomes of learning, we tend to use a narrow frame. We tend to focus on those things we know, which tend to be knowledge and skills. And we tend to miss out those things which are important, but not often as widely understood. If I were in Australia with my friends there, I'd be calling them capabilities. My preferred word is dispositions. So it's the capability of taking your knowledge, taking your skill, and applying it in perhaps unfamiliar contexts. And that requires disciplined practice. It requires a whole series of low stress opportunities to exercise your learning and to receive feedback in real time, and sometimes in a formative way and sometimes in a summative way. So I'm slightly dodging your question here, Tanya, but I think we need to go right back to basics and rethink the way we specify education, so that you're not just got knowledge and skill, but you've also got dispositions. And then think about, so how do we teach them? And then think about holistically, and how do we evidence them?
Thank you so much. And I think the buzzwords that my takeaway is going to be creativity and innovation in assessment. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hand over now to Meenakshi. Meenakshi, will you take over, please?
Yes.
Thank
you, Tanya. And I now invite Dr. Sandra Milligan. Sandra, you are an experienced researcher, teacher, company director, publisher, and business operator. And wearing all these hats, you work in the area of education. So let's listen to your ideas on reforms to assessment systems, which will lead to holistic learning and assessments. Sandra, over to you now.
Right. Thank you very much. I feel as though I've got some hard acts to follow there. And one thing that makes me very happy is that I think Bill and I think very much alike, so that the sorts of things that I say, I hope will complement what Bill's saying. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different point of view, although I think we're saying the same things. because the work that we do at the University of Melbourne depends very much on the fact that my centre is not funded by the university, it's funded by our research partners and our industry partners, who are mostly schools. So what that means is that we have to do a good job. We have to be practical. We have to actually be useful to our research partners. And the work that we've focused on over the last 5 to 10 years goes entirely, Tanya, to the question you asked, which was about objectives and goals and so forth. And what I've found over the years is, if you talk to any principal about what they want their graduates to be like, hardly any of them say things like, I want them to know the periodic table. What they talk about are broader things like citizenship, ethics, being able to collaborate, knowing how to learn, because we all know that the actual knowledge is changing. Those are the things that principals talk about to their parents. That's what I imagine. There are a lot of principals in the here today, so they will know what I'm talking about. When people put their children in schools, they want the school to look after the broad curriculum. Now, Bill called it they have an expansive view. I talk about, and he also talked about zest. In our work, we talk about thrive. Everyone wants the students to have the attitudes, values, beliefs, knowledge, and know-how that mean they will thrive. Now, the reason people, I think that's fairly universal. The reason people come to us is that eventually they put so much effort into their curriculum and their learning design and their marketing and everything to talk about this thrive. And then eventually they realize, but people actually value what you assess. And if you don't assess these kinds of things, they become devalued, and people focus only on the things that you assess, periodic tables and things like that. And that's all very well. So then people say, well, we definitely want to assess those kinds of things. I might just share, have I got sharing rights? Let me see. No, I haven't got sharing rights. That's okay. I'll just keep going. Oh, have I got sharing rights now? Yes, I have. Can you see that? So look, this slide, don't put too much attention onto it, but it's the kind of, so we now don't talk about curriculum, we talk about learning ambitions for thrive. And these are the sorts of things teachers and principals want to assess so that they can assess what they value. Now, these things like know-how and knowledge, we can all do that. Things like basic literacies, we can all do that. We've been doing that for 50 to 100 years. But these things like learner agency, like connectivity to the school, to their friends, to the community, to the culture, to the place, and the learning staples, the creative thinking and communication, etc. These are really hard to assess. And people usually come to us and say, well, we know we can't assess these ones on the right-hand side using standardized assessments. You cannot assess them using pencil and paper tests. Bill, I'm not sure whether we'd agree here. I'm sort of, can Pisa really assess these kinds of things? I don't really know. We can have an argument about that if we ever get to meet face to face. But our view is you cannot assess them using traditional methods. You need a different method. You need a different method because these things like communication, like collaboration, like critical and creative thinking. They're not knowledge, they are competencies, which are a mixture of knowledge, skills, attitudes and values and beliefs that don't operate separately. They combine together. So the question in addressing how do you assess these kinds of things has to do with how you assess a person's competence to in these areas. And the key to that, in our view, is that you don't treat them like you treat assessment in science or mathematics or literacy or whatever. What you're actually looking for is leaps or jumps, not very many, qualitative jumps in competence that students go through in these areas as they become more and more competent as citizens or as ethical operators. And the trick in the assessment is to make sure that teachers and other assessors can actually identify the behaviours of students that are attached to each of these qualitative shifts. This is where progressions come in, learning progressions, if you like, or competence progressions, as I like to think. Here's a rough example of one that we used in the Philippines for citizenship. And at the bottom of the progression, you've got a young person or even an adult, really. This works from kindergarten right through, who is not an active citizen. They're directed. They do as they're told. They obey laws and so forth. And there are only sort of 4 or 5 leaps before you get right up to an active citizen who is a leader, who really embodies good social practice. And the trick of assessment is to give teachers the tools to be able to position a learner on this sort of progression. At this stage, I know Bill's seen this before, he's probably bored with it, but the method of assessment that we use, I capture it in what I call my poem of assessment in complex competencies, because this is not like standardized testing. It's not like the assessments we do of the periodic table or science. It's developmental, standards reference, not standardized, multi-evidence, and I've captured it in these small number of lines. It's not a poem really, it's a definition of a new form of assessment. But it is a process, it's not an event, of gathering evidence, very wide types of evidence about what learners do and say and make and write to support a judgment about their position on the scale of competence. That is the progression from less expert to more expert, showing what they know and what they need to do next, with a degree of confidence that everyone trusts what's happening. So that's the challenge for assessment of these broad competencies, or whatever you like to call them. I call them capabilities, as Bill said. That's the trick, but to be able to get a trusted position of a person on one of these progressions. With our schools at the moment, we have we're developing what we're calling a universal suite of assessments, so that any school in Australia, and we've used some internationally as well, can produce assessments that they can trust, that position a learner on these progressions so that they can show what the learner knows, what they need to do next, and that is sufficiently trusted that you can use it for various purposes, which I'll come to in a minute. On the right-hand side, there are the progressions that we're working on at the moment. And we find, the thing is, we find, as Bill will no doubt know, that the progressions that develop in Britain in India, in Australia, in America, they're all at essence the same, because we're all human and we all develop in these sort of areas in much the same way. So we're developing a set of instruments that will support teachers and schools to make these judgments about where people are positioned. And as Bill said, the best way for our schools to present that is in a learner profile. Now, I'm going to just finish there because, and I hope you've got a sense of what it means for schools who work with us. So they pick some areas, some learning ambitions that they've defined at their school. We help them develop the progression based on the universal sense of development that we know kids go through. We provide them with the resources they need so that they can make the judgments and present a profile, something like this. The really exciting thing in Australia is that now our universities, which up until now have used a single ranking ATAR academic performance system to get students in, they're saying, funny thing is that academic rankings, like our head of med school says, getting 99 rank on an academic scale does not mean you're going to be the greatest doctor that we produce. The architecture section says that doesn't produce the greatest architects. As long as you've got, say, 80% percentile in your ranking, the thing that makes the difference is the kind of things that are in these profiles, how tenacious you are, whether you can collaborate, whether you're creative. And so being able to do a profile like this is starting to become really of interest to the universities in Australia to figure out how they can predict the people that who will do really well in their top courses. So it's a very interesting time in Australia. It's a wonderful time to be working in this area. I'm so looking forward to the time when standardized tests are put in their proper place. I'm not against standardized tests. I'm against them being the only thing we look at, and we need to supplement them with other things. So I'm going to finish there. And thank you very much for having me. I feel great honour to be talking to you, and I sincerely wish I was with you in India. We're so sick of being trapped in Australia. So I'm so sorry that I'm not there in person. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. It was a beautiful session and your presentation was so good. And you said that you have to arrange funds to kind of run your center in the university. Now, this is such a powerful statement. And, in India, we are also starting the same culture by which we are teaching entrepreneurship to our children, that they have to learn to arrange funds and become entrepreneurs and job creators. So you are a wonderful example of entrepreneurship in education, I would say. And it is so nice to hear that all these 21st century skills like critical thinking, all these things did exist. They've existed always into the system, but the assessment was faulty. And of course, with whatever you have said and Professor Lucas has said, I'm sure we'll be able to develop better assessment systems which will make teaching learning process more interesting and more meaningful. So thank you so much, Sandra. It was a beautiful session we had with you. And going next to our next speaker is Ms. Jayashree Oza. Now, Ms. Oza has tremendous experience in Indian educational government bodies like NCERT and all other institutions which are of great, huge value. So, Dr. Jayashree, could I invite you to address us on your ideas of assessments?
Thank you so much. Am I audible and clear?
Yes, yes,
Thank
you
you.
are.
First and foremost, I want to thank the chairperson and the management committee of NPSC and all my fellow educators that to have this privilege to be with you. It seems like almost I'm the last speaker, and not necessarily a best thing to do. However, it has been a great day, a lot of learning. I also see in terms of challenge, this morning session when we talk about early childhood and primary classes, and from there to this absolutely phenomenally brilliant space that we are talking towards in terms of how, firstly, how do we develop our students to be creative, to be, I mean, a variety of all of the skills and competencies and that Professor Lucas and Professor Milligan talked about. Also, I'm looking at what is the real context in which our examination system is today, as you yourself mentioned, and how do we traverse the journey in terms of being able to make that happen and make it more real for our school system in that sense. Very interestingly, I would like to start by saying that, when we talk about this, the holistic, because the theme is assessment for holistic learning. We talk about holistic, and of course, that's been termed in different ways. We talk about cognitive, psychosocial development and physical and others. And with that, bringing out all of the specifics that we talk about. What is important, what actually, in the biggest exam of his life today, if I look at the Ukrainian president, who is by profession a comedian, which means he's intelligent. He's a great dancer, actually proficient dancer, because he's won a lot of those, competitions. And in response to United Nations call for his support, his evacuation, his response was, "I need more weapons, not a ride." I think it tells so much about his social responsibility. And most importantly, his character in terms of being able to lead his country in face of such an adversity. I think it just sums up the kind of people that we need to have in this world. And to me, can we assess this? I think here is the biggest exam of his life, and he's obviously making headways towards it. So while we talk about holistic assessment, I want to also more focus on word learning. Learning is a continuous process, and we have more structured, like whether we call it curriculum, whether we call it content, whether we call it the ambitions that we would like to learn, processes of teaching and learning, but processes of all kinds of methods by which children absorb and learn, and assessment. These are three integral to each other. Now, to say that is our education system, there are other areas. By osmosis, children are learning. The kind of learning materials they have, the quality of teachers that they teach, the quality of infrastructure available to them. We need to really be asking ourselves, are there opportunities for children to be able to grow physically, in dexterity? Do they have opportunities to be able to develop their socio-emotional skills and the kind of competencies that were just described by my learned panelists? More and more, so when we talk about what should be those learning outcomes, I think first and foremost, we need to define. I think Sandra said very clearly that talking to the principals and leaders, it clearly says we would like citizens who have great values. We want creative people. We want people who can innovate. You yourself talked about entrepreneurship. Are we able to, in a granular sense, are we able to put those into our systems is one of the questions that we need to ask, because we cannot be assessing children or students unless we have created an enabling environment for them to learn all these things. And I think that would be one of the most important points that I would like to raise. What is our current assessment system? When we're looking at our current, we probably pay more attention to one or the other, but I would say broadly 4 kinds of assessments that we have in our education system today. formative assessment. I will be talking a little more about it in a while. The second is possibly where the mentors and like your department heads and principals and other who visits classrooms and look at children's work and look at teaching and learning, possibly even invite a couple of students out of the class and maybe test them. What is that data going to do? Once again, it is formative in nature. Are we using that to have meetings with the teachers to help them understand their own performances better? Are we able to do it? The third kind of assessment that we are fairly familiar with, which is end of the year board examinations, the ranking and the grading and all of that. There too, the purpose for those assessments is to say, have children achieve mastery of the competencies that we would expect them to have learned. Those competencies doesn't have to be just math and literacy. It could be all kinds of competencies that we could be talking about. Once again, have we created spaces for that in terms of the environment as well as in assessment? And the fourth kind of assessment, which my hope is that most of your schools participate, but it's more like National Achievement Survey type of assessments, or with TIMSS, Pisa, and others, large-scale sample-based assessments. From those assessments, the idea is that as a system, can we learn in terms of are we teaching the right thing and are we testing the right thing? Should our programs be made different? Should our curriculum be made more wider, broader? Or any new program when we initiate to create a baseline? Those are the purposes for which we are using these 4 assessments. My assumption is, and I hope I'm wrong, that most of the time, the assessment that we are using is end of the unit, end of the year, end of the course kind of examinations. I will be talking a little more because you referred to assessment of learning, which I think we are, I'm not saying we necessarily do the best job of it, but we are fully familiar with it. But assessment for learning and assessment as learning is a terminology which has come into, maybe intuitively we did it, but in terms of our vocabulary has come in recent past. And I'm not entirely sure we have developed all those methods to imbibe that or put it as part of the school or education culture. What is the difference? The formative assessment essentially it's a more continuous, it's a low stake for children and for the schools and for the teachers. It is to look at what are my students' needs, what do they know in terms of its own progression towards those outcomes that we desire, and be able to support that by the teacher, by the environment. What can we do to do that? Whereas in terms of summative assessments, I think it's important to understand that we are really looking at, do children know? What do they need to know? And what is the criterion for judging it? And that is one thing I'm not too sure that we are, and this is not universal for all our schools. I'm talking from my experience and working with the schools in public private schools like yours, as well as in the larger system of government, that we possibly do not articulate it well enough for our students to know what are those criterion. You rightly mentioned, I want my students to be creative. The student doesn't know, how are you going to assess me? And that is important. And how do we develop that vocabulary for them and be able to explicitly be able to share with them? Let's talk about, and this is somewhere I would say for primary and particularly early age, new education policy has a second chapter, first and the second chapter on early literacy and numeracy, foundational learning. There is a mission which has been started by the Central Ministry, Nipun Bharat. And that is where it is defining what children should have learned at the end of it. I do believe personally that literacy and numeracy at that early age is critical. It's a gateway to all the other learning. So if a child is unable to read, as we heard this morning, that even in grade 5 and 6, maybe they're struggling how to read and then be able to comprehend. I think Rukmani talked about that she read, but necessarily didn't comprehend. And I think ensuring that in early stages, by the time the child is in grade 3, that we have kind of ensured that. I'm going to talk about, in terms of how explicitly we can. Now, whether if we are talking about children making decisions, because I do believe that in terms of futuristic or 21st century, we are looking at how students can make choices and decisions based on the knowledge and information they have. How do they create relationship with the world around them, environment around them, with the other people, other culture, other dispositions, right? And be able to and make choices, and definitely learn how to learn, because all the content that they're learning today from those textbooks today is going to be obsolete. Today we heard about in the technology session that a lot of that is at the press of a button even today. So what is it that they need to learn which is new and different and which will keep changing constantly? I think those are the skills that they need to acquire, but they need to know what that is. I would like to talk about in terms of, because here is the audience, which is in leadership roles. I want to talk about how do we support and monitor the processes across all, in pedagogical and the environment that we create, all of that. But I will focus particularly on the cycle of assessments that we do. May I get a screen, because I want to share just a few quick slides in terms of how to. Thank you. I talked about the monitoring is, let me just increase that monitoring and support is critical for students, but most importantly, even for our teachers, particularly. What gets not gets done, and we know that. And this is for good teachers who are brilliant, but they also would like to know that there is somebody watching and somebody is acknowledging. And certainly for those teachers who are either new or change subject or change the levels where they're teaching, and it's important. And how best do we do it? And I will come to that in a quick second, but I will focus particularly on the very quick. There are probably 14 different stages to the process steps for assessment. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Thank you so much. I would start with, all assessments need to have a purpose, and the purpose can be defined and can be articulated well with the assessment framework. When I talk about formative assessment, we are talking about the teachers being able to use the information emanating from those assessments, that the teachers are able to use that information to be able to guide groups of students. I will take one example, that in grade 3, if we are expecting students to do 3-digit subtraction, and I will stay with the grade 3 and the kind of hard learning outcomes that we are more familiar with in order to exemplify this. If we know that, and at the end of the assessment, if we analyze the data, we will be able to see that some students will not be able to do calculation, probably. Some of them can they can borrow, but may not be able to do regrouping in a right manner. And some will be able to complete the sum, but in real life situation may not be able to use that. And all these 3 groups of students, and I'm only saying 3, there could be more, but all these 3 groups of students need more support in terms of how do we help them go forward. It could be for a grade 8 student, particularly, and looking at to say, how does he or she make choices and decisions? And we'll talk a little more to that in terms of what is directly impacting the child. The next stage is high quality item and instrument design. And are we monitoring all these things? Are we making sure that we are doing the right thing? So I'm actually in a way pulling back from what my previous panelists talked about, and to saying, unless we really be good at these things, moment we broaden and expand this area, because what does it mean? High quality instrument and item. If I say instrument is your question paper and items are your test questions, but yes, we want to talk about many more types of assessment tools and instruments, right? What does it mean high quality? It is in terms of validity. And there are many technical points that I could raise, but one that I want to raise here, what does it mean by validity? That are we testing what we would like to know? What do children know and can do? Now, that could be in mathematics in grade 3. It could be in terms of being able to be creative. What is it that our children can produce, right? by way of showing their creativity. That, do we have right instruments to be able to assess that? I think that is something we need to be looking for too. Standard operating procedures. We possibly know how to conduct examinations. I'm not entirely sure that we would know, and we need to expand on this. And this is where I mean that we educators, particularly progressive schools like yours, we could begin to expand with, supported by Professor Luke, the people like Professor Lucas and Professor Milligan. But we need to develop our own knowledge in these areas. What does it, the standard operating procedures would talk about, how do we screen and look at those kinds of instruments that we develop? How do we manage data? How do we analyze? When you saw Sandra presenting the profile of the students, or also Bill, you looked at it in terms of when we analyze our data in a longitudinal manner, do we have child's profile being built as a result of that through our MS system and education management information system? Do we keep those plots ready so that we are able to slowly begin to enrich those? Reporting and dissemination. The school education system has many stakeholders and they have different needs. If we are able to report according to or in response to their needs, they will be able to support the system. And finally, and the most important part of all assessment, is planning of assessment data use. When we conduct assessment, it should be used to further student learning. And that's probably extremely important. I will be talking, I do want to share a little more about the formative assessment, as I had mentioned, and what would the formative assessments look like? Formative assessment is ongoing, it's continuous. These are at the classroom level. The primary focus is student learning, and it is supported by teachers, parents, and self-study by the students, surely. These assessments look at movement towards and learning outcomes. And whatever those learning outcomes would be, they don't need to be watertight, bound, defined, but needs to be some kind of descriptions, as even the descriptions of progression, which was shown by Sandra in terms of profile development. But that knowing where am I going, what is the future course of action, it motivates students. It creates an opportunity for teachers and students to interact in a constructive feedback processes. And the errors are seen as learning opportunities, because these are not the scores to rank or to provide grades. What is important in terms of scope? I talked about frequency, that it should be frequently done. Could be done through demonstration, written or oral test, teacher-made quizzes, test. But even this, whatever I've mentioned here, even we can go way beyond that, the kind of projects, kind of the other opportunities that we can provide. What is important when I say homework or assignments, many of you will tell me that we do this, and I'm sure that you do. Not only do you do, but you invest a huge amount of time and effort in correcting those. I think a while back in a prior session, Chris talked about him being an English teacher, and when he gave back the feedback after laboring hard over those assignments and gave it back, the student said, "Thank you," and walked away. And that's what often happens. What is important in formative assessment is, are we using the data emanating from those assessments into helping students learn further? And this is where I would raise two simple examples. One simple example is we spend hours and a lot of effort in correcting student assignments. And in the 4th month of the academic session, do we look at it, stop and ask ourselves, whatever corrections are made in the spelling or in calculation for these children or this child, is it recurring in the months till now? If it is, then we did not use the data emanating from that. If we were investing time in helping students correct those mistakes, then we will never have to look back. That is corrected and made correct forever. And I think that is important. Also equally important is, as I already mentioned, that the students know what are the criterion for success. I did say that I want to talk about the monitoring and support that we can provide as leaders in the school. And while I talked about the formative assessment data need not go upwards, it is for the teacher. Nonetheless, teachers must maintain such data in terms of, and I want to go back to the very basic in terms of at a grade 1 level, for example, or grade 2 level. If we look at the literacy, the competencies that we would like students to have in terms of whether it's letter identification, familiar word, oral fluency, etc. on one axis, and another axis students, be able to then plot to say, are children at a mastery level, near mastery level, or at remediation? Now, the same kind of plotting could be done for grade 7 or 8 or 9 child on a different metric altogether. The idea is that we need to know where our students are going and moving. And the same chart could be through formative assessment can be followed through to say in the first 2 competencies, in the first formative assessment, we may find that the percentage of students who are at 45 or 50 degrees or 50% of students are at a mastery level or a proficient level, we will find that if the progression is going on in the right direction, then by the time the formative assessment 3 takes place, we will find that the percentage of students at a mastery level or a proficient level have increased to about 75%. And we are adding the other competencies for them to become more proficient at literacy. What is the next level in terms of, so this is at a teacher level that we maintain that, and that remains with the teacher. At the end of your summative assessment, which is your half yearly and yearly and end of the year, for the departmental heads, may be really important to be able to see that against the learning, once again, it's a framework that you create in terms of learning outcomes. What percentage of students are at a proficiency level, are they in middle and the learning, and those who require support and mediation? I think important for the departmental heads and leadership roles to be able to support teachers and be able to help in terms of materials and other resources that can be provided to the teachers. So assessment can be used for developing and ensuring that, now in this particular instance, we are talking about literacy or numeracy, but it could be on any other skill and competency we would like them to be growing with. But using of this data, firstly, having that and using it is really important. Similarly, for principal level, what is it that you would like to know? There are overall goals in terms of for literacy, numeracy, for creativity, on this different metric and different competencies that we would like the students to develop. At each grade level, he or she should be able to see in a particular subject, in a particular discipline, where are our students and how many are in the process of learning and how many have achieved better, a competency. I think that kind of record keeping is important longitudinally to also be able to help our teachers and guide them. Your schools, I'm sure, have education management information system. What is important is, are we tracking each student and developing profiles in whatever learning metrics that we desire and we define? Are we having this kind of trajectory vis-a-vis what is it that the children would have, even their own ambition, what would they like to have learned and where are they in that? Are we having analysis by groups in terms of ethnic minority, gender, in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of linguistic background in our classrooms? All of our classrooms are multilingual largely. And do we have those trends so that we can help students be able to further learn, be able to help teacher community to be able to take it forward? And such an information system and a digital platform will surely increase ability to monitor, support, and even at different points in time to hold stakeholders accountable. The last and significant point I want to make is all assessments, the data emanating from data which gets information that gets generated out of it must be used to further the student learning, further the school system, further the system. And this is like, weighing a cow. After that, if we do not change the diet of the cow or the daily routine, it is going to remain just where it is. We need to know get this information and be able to utilize that. And in different ways it can be. So for improving learning, it is, of course, firstly encouraging students. We talked about assessment as learning. You know what, that assessment, there is a high when you're performing and you get results from that. Promoting, assisting, fostering different ways of learning for the students. This is, of course, important for the classrooms, for the schools and the system. For reporting outcomes for different stakeholders that I had mentioned earlier, including parents, students, teachers, heads of the departments, school authorities, ministries, but also for those who maintain records of certification, selection, qualification in perpetuity, and modifying programs. In India, we know because of the wide variety and plurality in terms of our student body, from rural to urban, from very marginalized to privileged schools like your schools, that in that we do need to have interventions of different kind to help student bodies at different levels to be able to improve in their learning and progression. And what by doing large-scale assessment like achievement surveys and all, what can we ensure that we are able to give information which will help modify the program in terms of curriculum, in terms of teacher training, and strategies for individual teachers to support individual teachers to system and the schools and the larger system. With this, I would like to stop this presentation and essentially say, let's ensure that we are using the information emanating out of assessment, no matter what our metrics in terms of learning that we have.
Thank you, Jayashree. Thank you so
Sure.
much. It was a wonderful session. And it was so good to note about the steps in assessment process, details about formative assessment, that the purpose for assessing should be very, very clear at all stages, and the importance of managing and analyze the data, and that data should be used for furtherance of education. Wonderful to know it all. It's just one question that often, not only often, but always, the college level entrance exams don't match up with all this. And hence, you know, the schools are always in a fix that should they teach this way or the college admission way, because most of the students come for college admissions, not for education per se, and not to develop the skills, etc. So what do you have to say for that?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I think we are now talking about three different spectrums. One is the higher education, the school as college admissions. In the school, what are we doing today? And the spectrum that we talked about, what is our ambition? What is our wish? We want our children to be creative, innovative, all that. When we go back to the college entrance test, it's different. And that's why we have a lot of those coaching classes and that culture prevalent. I do want to say, education must be for the life. So of course, it should lead you to higher education. It must provide opportunities for obviously for future professions and the life choices that you make, but it also must be for how well you can lead your life, right? And in some ways, I think the responsibility, much more of the responsibility has come to the schools today. We see most recent cases in newspaper and others to say for well-being of the students, not only academic, particularly emotional and social. We have seen most recent past from Faridabad school that also has become a responsibility not only of course of the teachers and as a result of the principals. So are we then doing good job of ensuring that we are able to fulfill that role? In terms of college admissions, my hope is that more and more, because those admissions, and particularly professional colleges, will have to directly match up with the market requirement, which schools may not be as touched at the moment, but we need to make sure that we are moving in that direction. And for that, I think what Sandra said it explicitly, and I absolutely agree with that, is beyond the marks, what is going to count is, can you problem solve? Are you empathic? Can you Can you relate to other people who are disadvantaged, people who are advantaged? Even from your schools, very often I think about it, they will be in leadership roles. They may become doctors, engineers, run industries, but the people whom they will be working with, a large number of that population may come from schools which are not that advantaged. They will need to learn how to relate to those people, right? More and more, but they're hungry, right? We find well-known organizations like Wipro and others, high level cutting edge technology institutes are looking from students who have come from B class townships and cities, because they know their hunger. They know that they will train them for 6 months in their own companies and put them on job because they're so hungry and they want to do it. Are we able to create that hunger, that desire that I want to achieve? And I think those are the important parts that I would like to say.
Yes,
they must
very
know
right.
Basic literacy, numeracy, science, they must know all that, because that is what is the foundation. But beyond that, I think we need to develop that whole human being.
Very right. So I think besides assessments, we should also develop that hunger for knowledge, for that application, etc., etc. So thank you so much, Jayashree. And I would now request Tanya to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Meenakshi. I think we've had a wonderful session. And, before the session, I was wondering how would we be able to have 3 such eminent speakers. But, there is something called Trilogy of Gods. So I would label you as Trilogy of Gods for assessment. Thank you so very much, because I would call upon, Sudha to please, maybe again, we should have a session with all of them, because this is something which, as has been, we've been saying it since the morning, to learn, then unlearn and relearn. Because we've heard terms like expansive education, thrive for education, zest for education, and Professor Milligan's poem on assessment. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you, Meenakshi, for moderating the session. And thank you, Dr. Sudha Acharya. Thank you so much.
If I may come in, Sandra, I have shared your poem with everybody in India.
Yes.
We have
It's
a
beautiful.
group of principals, so I was so impressed. I have given there. And both of your, Professor Bill Lucas, and your presentation, slide by slide, it is coming there. Oh, we learned this much, we learned that much. So they are all very, very highly impressed. And Jayashree ma'am, I have heard you so many times, and it was a pleasure to have you here. And if you can share your presentation, everybody is asking, can we have their presentation? We learn a lot. So then I can mail them. I mean, there are, I think, 5,000 principals, they will be benefited by this. So it was a brilliant, brilliant session. So I think we will call them again, Sandra and Professor Lucas and Jayashree ma'am, we'll call you again for an extensive session on assessment. And Sandra, if I can ask you a little bit, here in India, we are talking about 360-degree multidisciplinary assessment, like parent feedback, teacher feedback, student self-assessment. What is your perspective? What is going on at that point of your side? What is happening there?
Yeah. I think if you look at my poem, you'll see that inherent in that is that the idea that for these complex competencies, you must have 360-degree assessments from a variety of people, because it's the judgment that's important. Because, machines can't make the judgment that humans can. But to make judgments reliable, you need a large number of them. So the 360 is really terrific, including self-assessment, because one of the themes that we're finding is that we're producing as many assessment materials for students as we are for teachers. So students are getting more and more agency in saying what they want to be assessed on. In other words, we're not only looking for how good is this student, but how is this student good? It's a bit of a twist. and the students know what they're good at, so they can pick what they want to be assessed on to a certain degree, and who knows them well enough to assess them, and they can interpret it. They can become the data analysts and run their own formative assessment. So, you know, I'm sorry, I probably should have been briefer, but it's a passion of mine, this whole area. So yes, I think 360 to be brief is very important. Thank you.
We are here shifting from report card, which has a negative connotation. You know, we are moving towards holistic progress card. And
Yes.
trying to create a learner's profile. I mean, when the child is coming in kindergarten and passing out high school, so we try to create a learner's profile through the progress throughout the years. So instead of reporting the progress, we are progressing the holistic progress, how the child is moving over the years. So that's the change in new education policy in India. So I'm sure we will call you again, invite you again for 1 hour session in NPSC, because a lot more to know from your perspective and what is happening at the other part of the world. And we can share what is happening here in India. So Meenakshi, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And surely we would call them and learn more. And I think the session is over because the next in line, the other people in line are waiting. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for this wonderful session. A very insightful quote by Lao Tzu. Find a teacher who is an integral being, a beacon who extends his light and virtue with equal ease to those who appreciate him and those who don't. Shape yourself in his mold, bathe in his nourishing radiance, and reflect it out to the rest of the world.